It's funny how silence can be the loudest thing in a room full of people, especially when it follows your own mother's words like a slap no one saw coming. I remember standing there, in the backyard we grew up in, folding chairs on the lawn, those little string lights Dad put up back in 2008 still sagging between the trees, and the old gas grill hissing in the background like it knew something was coming. Graduation night was supposed to be about closing chapters, turning corners, finally being seen for everything you'd worked your ass off to become. But for me, it ended up being the beginning of something else entirely. I had spent 4 years grinding through pre-med, tutoring underclassmen, volunteering at the shelter on weekends, and holding down 2 part-time jobs. Chloe? She dropped out of cosmetology school twice, and still somehow managed to be the headline of every family dinner. I used to think that maybe I wasn't flashy enough, that maybe if I wore more eyeliner or smiled like Chloe smiled, my mother would stop looking at me like I was the background character in her story. But I learned, eventually, that there's no amount of achievement that makes someone love you if they never planned to in the first place. So when Diane, that's what I call her now, not Mom anymore, and you'll see why, lifted her wine glass under the soft light of that plastic backyard chandelier and said, to Emily, who's made us so proud tonight, "We always knew you'd do well, sweetie." There was the second where I thought, maybe this time will be different. But then she smiled that smile, the one with no warmth in it, and added, of course, Chloe will always be the beautiful one. No one spoke. Not a soul. You could hear the bug zapper crack in the distance and someone shifting awkwardly in a lawn chair. I looked at my father, who had finally decided to show up after years of silence, and even he looked like he wanted to melt into the grass. Chloe giggled, like it was a compliment. And Diane? She just sipped her drink and looked over at me, like she'd just handed me a slice of cake. I didn't cry. That's the part people can't seem to wrap their heads around. I smiled. I raised my glass. I said, "Thank you all for coming." And then I walked inside. The thing is, when someone stabs you in the chest with a sentence, you don't always bleed right away. Sometimes you feel nothing. You go numb. You serve the damn pie you baked yourself. You ask people if they want decaf. You pack up the gift bags. You clean the counter that's already spotless just to keep your hands from shaking. Because if you stop moving, if you let the moment sink its claws into your spine, you might not stand up again. Chloe came inside later, tipsy and happy and completely unaware. "You looked great out there, Em," she said, kicking off her heels in the hallway like we were 16 again. "Mom didn't mean it that way. You know how she is." And I just nodded. I said, "Yeah, I know exactly how she is." And I think that's when something shifted behind my eyes, something even I hadn't felt before. It wasn't anger. I'd lived through anger. It was something colder, quieter, like a final breath you didn't know you were holding. I waited until everyone left. The backyard cleared out like someone had turned off a switch. Dad slipped away first, of course. Always the first to vanish. Chloe passed out in her old bedroom, reeking of champagne and childhood perfume. And Diane? She stayed out on the back porch, glass in hand, staring out into the trees like she expected something to answer her. Maybe God. Maybe guilt. I walked out there around midnight. She didn't even turn to look at me. "Do you remember the dress I wore to my 8th grade graduation?" I asked her. She blinked slowly, like she wasn't sure if I was real or a ghost. "You made me wear Chloe's hand-me-down," said it looked better on her. She sipped her wine. No apology. No acknowledgement. Just silence and cicadas. I sat down next to her, careful not to sit too close. "I spent years trying to earn your love," I said. "And tonight I realized I was chasing something that didn't exist. You didn't want 2 daughters. You wanted a mirror and a spotlight." Diane's lips parted, like she wanted to argue, but nothing came out. I could see it in her eyes, fear. Not of me, but of herself. Of what she'd done, maybe, or what she hadn't. We sat there for a long time, not speaking, just breathing in the humidity and decades of rot that no one had ever bothered to name. At some point, I got up. I whispered something to her then. I won't tell you what it was. Some things don't belong in stories. All I'll say is, when I went to bed, the house was still. No footsteps. No creaking floors. And when I woke up the next morning, there was a text from Chloe waiting on my phone. Mom hasn't left her bed. What did you do? And maybe that's the real story. Not what I said. But what finally broke her? Because words can be sharper than knives, and truth, when it's been buried long enough, cuts the deepest of all. Now you tell me this. If someone publicly humiliated you after a lifetime of emotional neglect, would you have done the same? Or walked away and let the past rot quietly? Think hard. Because the line between justice and cruelty gets damn blurry when you've spent your whole life being invisible. The sunlight came through the blinds like it had no idea what had happened the night before, cutting neat stripes across my old comforter, the same one I had in high school. As if time had folded in on itself and dumped me back into a version of my life I thought I'd grown out of. I lay there for a few seconds, the kind where you're still drifting between sleep and reality, thinking maybe the whole thing had been a bad dream. The string lights, the clinking glasses, Diane's voice slicing through the air like a rusted saw blade. Maybe it was all just my subconscious finally losing patience with years of bottled rage. But then I reached for my phone and reality landed hard. Chloe's name lit up the screen like a flare, and her message was waiting, sharp, simple, laced with panic that didn't belong to her usual careless tone. Mom hasn't left her bed. What did you do? I sat up slowly, not because I was afraid, but because I wanted to feel the weight of those words in my chest before I stood. What did I do? That's the kind of question that doesn't really ask for an answer. It's an accusation dressed like concern. I stared at it for a while, letting the silence of the house wrap around me. No sound from the hallway. No clinking of cups in the kitchen. Just stillness, thick and strange, like the air right before a tornado drops. I didn't respond right away. Part of me wondered if Chloe had finally run out of excuses for Diane. If maybe she'd opened her eyes just a sliver last night. But no, her message wasn't about that. It wasn't about what Diane said to me, or the years of quiet cruelty that she always shrugged off as jokes, or just how mom is. It was about Diane now, lying in bed like a damn Victorian widow, silent and still, and Chloe had already decided the reason had to be me. So I typed back only 2 words. I talked. I got up, moved through the hallway like a ghost, passing family portraits that told a completely different story from the one I'd lived. There we were, smiling in matching dresses, Chloe with her arm draped around me like she owned me, Diane standing behind us with that permanent pageant smile. Anyone would think we were close, that this was a house where love was served warm and daily. But if you looked closer, you could see the space in my eyes, the way my shoulders never quite leaned in. I knocked once on Chloe's door before pushing it open. She was already dressed, sitting on the edge of the bed, one shoe on, phone clenched in her hand like it might answer the question she couldn't bring herself to ask out loud. She looked up, eyes rimmed red, mascara smudged from last night. She won't talk to me, she said, voice barely above a whisper. She won't move. She just keeps staring at the wall. I nodded and leaned against the doorframe, watching her fumble for understanding. Chloe wasn't used to things she couldn't control with a smile, a tear, or a phone call to Dad. Watching her spiral without a script was almost surreal. What did you say to her? She asked again, and this time the panic was clearer, sharper. What the hell did you say? I told her the truth, I said, slow and even. Maybe for the first time in her life. Chloe stood, arms folded tight across her chest. You always made her out to be some kind of monster. But she was under so much pressure after the divorce. She did her best. I laughed, short and bitter. Her best was turning you into her golden girl and using you to remind me I'd never be enough. Chloe flinched like I'd hit her, but I didn't back down. I walked past her, down the hall, until I reached the door to Diane's room. It was closed, of course. Always closed when things got hard. When Dad left. When I got sick that one year in college, and she told me to stop being dramatic. When Chloe failed out of school and Diane threw a party 2 weeks later like nothing had happened. I stood there, hand hovering near the knob, but I didn't go in. I didn't need to see her like that. Because I already knew the look that would be in her eyes: confusion, betrayal, maybe even guilt, though I wouldn't bet on it. She never knew how to process consequences. Not emotional ones, anyway. I didn't scream, I said quietly, knowing Chloe had followed me. I didn't raise my voice. I just told her I saw her. For who she really is. And for once, she couldn't laugh it off. That's all. She's your mother, Chloe said, the words cracking like old paint. And I'm her daughter, I said back. But only when it served her. We stood there for a long time, the three of us separated by a single door and 30 years of unspoken truths. Eventually, Chloe went back to her room and shut the door, and I went downstairs to make coffee like it was any other Sunday morning. But it wasn't, and we both knew it. Here's what I want to ask you, and really think before you answer. If someone spends decades picking you apart in small, almost invisible ways, if they teach you your worth is conditional and only exists when it flatters them, what do you owe them once you finally see it clearly? Are you still expected to protect them from the truth they created? Or do you finally let it fall on them like a goddamn mirror, sharp edges and all? Because maybe, just maybe, some people don't break from what you did. They break because they can't unhear what they always knew was coming. Chloe's footsteps echoed in the downstairs hallway like she was marching into battle, her boots hitting the tile floor hard and fast, like maybe if she moved quickly enough she could outrun whatever truth was waiting for her behind that bedroom door. She didn't knock this time, didn't announce herself or pretend there was still something sacred about the boundaries of childhood rooms. We'd all grown out of those illusions years ago, even if none of us had said it out loud. I was at the kitchen sink rinsing out my coffee cup when she stormed in like a storm we all should have seen coming. "She's not eating," she said before I even turned around, her voice tight, like she'd been rehearsing it in the car and still didn't like how it sounded. "She hasn't said a word since last night." "What the hell did you do to her, Emily?" I turned slowly, letting the question hang between us for a moment too long, long enough for the weight of it to settle into the room like smoke. Chloe looked like hell, but a familiar kind of hell, the type she always wore after things didn't go her way, not the kind that came from true concern. Her makeup was smeared, her hair pulled up into a messy bun that she'd clearly thrown together in the car, and her leather jacket hung off one shoulder like she hadn't decided whether she was staying or going. I told her the truth, I said again, because it was still true, and because saying it out loud made it real for me too. And she listened. That's all. Bullshit, Chloe snapped, slamming her purse onto the table with a force that made the sugar bowl rattle. She's been lying in that bed like a corpse all morning. She won't look at me. She won't talk. She didn't even blink when I opened the blinds. She's not dead, Chloe, I said, slowly, clearly, like I was reminding her of something simple. She's processing. Chloe laughed then, sharp and hollow and laced with disbelief. Processing what? That her daughter finally talked back? That you decided to dump 27 years of resentment on her during your graduation party? No, I said, setting the cup down gently like it might shatter just from the noise of this conversation. She's processing the fact that I'm not afraid of her anymore. And that maybe, deep down, she's not the saint she always made herself out to be. Chloe leaned against the counter, arms crossed so tight it looked like she was trying to hold herself together. You always think you're the only one who got hurt. Like you had the monopoly on mom's bullshit. But she was hard on me too, Emily. I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time I saw a crack in her armor that hadn't been there before. She put you on a pedestal, so high you couldn't breathe, Chloe. She made you her trophy. That's not the same thing as love. For a second, I thought she might hit me. Not physically, but with one of those lines she was so good at, the ones that landed just below the belt and left a bruise you didn't notice until later. But instead, she turned away, walked to the fridge, opened it pointlessly, and stared into the light like it might offer her some clarity. "I just don't get it," she said finally. "She's never acted like this. Ever. You say you just talked, but I've seen Mom bounce back from worse." I nodded slowly, wiping my hands on a towel that still had a bleach stain from some long-forgotten mess. Maybe that's because no one ever held the mirror long enough for her to actually look. Chloe slammed the fridge door and turned to face me, eyes shining now not with tears, not yet, but with that frantic energy she always got when control started slipping from her fingers. "You think you're so righteous, don't you? Like you finally figured it all out, and now you get to stand there and judge us like we're the crazy ones." "I'm not judging you," I said, softer now, because for once I wasn't trying to win. "I'm just not pretending anymore." And maybe that's what scared her most. Not the confrontation, not Diane's silence, but the idea that I could finally walk into a room without waiting for permission to exist inside it. For so long, my role in this family had been to be the quiet one, the peacekeeper, the filler between the cracks in other people's messes. And now I was stepping out of that role, and Chloe didn't know who to be without me playing it. Eventually, she went upstairs. I stayed behind, watching the steam rise from the second cup of coffee I hadn't touched. I could hear her voice through the floorboards, soft and pleading, like she was talking to a child instead of the woman who used to command every room she walked into. Diane didn't answer. At least not with words. When Chloe came back down, she didn't say anything. She just grabbed her coat, her purse, and her keys. Before she walked out the door, she looked at me like she wanted to say something, anything, but nothing came. And maybe that's the point. Maybe silence isn't always a punishment. Sometimes it's just the sound of everything finally catching up with someone. Sometimes it's the echo of your own damn reflection finally speaking back. So again, I'll ask you, if you peel back the mask someone wore your entire life and they crumble underneath it, are you the villain for revealing it, or were they just too used to never being seen? You tell me. Because in this family, the truth has always had a habit of showing up late, but when it does, it doesn't knock. It breaks the damn door down. It had started with the sound of the wind chimes, clinking softly above the back porch like they were calling me outside, as if they, unlike the people in this house, had been waiting for this moment longer than I had. I stood in the doorway for a full minute before stepping out into the night air, where the silence didn't press so tightly against my ribs, where I could breathe without feeling like I was stealing space from someone else's story. Diane was already there, wrapped in the oversized cardigan she always claimed belonged to Dad, though he hadn't lived here for more than a decade. She didn't turn when she heard me approach, just sipped slowly from the same wine glass she'd been nursing since the toast, her face slack in a way that almost looked like peace if you didn't know what it really was. I sat beside her without asking, keeping a space between us wide enough to signal there was no comfort here, only unfinished business. For a while, neither of us spoke. The crickets filled the air like white noise, a low hum that almost made the moment feel ordinary, but it wasn't, not by a long shot. She must have known what I was there to say, and maybe that's why she kept quiet. Or maybe she was just tired of her own voice, for once. "I remember the first time I realized you liked Chloe more," I said eventually, not looking at her, eyes fixed on the outline of the trees just beyond the fence. It was second grade. I brought home a drawing of a horse. Wasn't great, but I was proud. You said I should ask Chloe to draw it instead, since hers would probably look less weird. I didn't draw again for 2 years. She shifted in her chair, but didn't respond. Her wine glass trembled slightly in her hand, and for a moment I wondered if she was cold or just finally realizing how much weight her words had carried over the years. But I didn't stop. "I got accepted into that out-of-state program when I was 17, I said, the words coming quicker now, like a train I couldn't slow down. "You told me it wasn't a good fit, and then 2 weeks later, Chloe suddenly had a new car, and you said we couldn't afford both. Funny how I never even asked for one. Still nothing. No apology. Not even denial. Just her jaw clenched tight enough to crack her molars, and a small breath pushed through her nose like maybe she was finally registering how much of this I'd stored away without a word. You turned her into your mirror, I said, softer now, not out of mercy, but because I didn't need to shout. Every time she smiled, you acted like it meant you were still beautiful. Every compliment she got was a victory for you. And me? I was the insurance policy. The one who wouldn't leave, wouldn't fight, wouldn't compete. Finally, she spoke, her voice rough like old paper, barely audible over the wind. You were always the quiet one. I was quiet, I said, turning to her now, meeting her eyes for the first time since that toast, because I learned early that making noise around you only ever made things worse. She flinched like I'd slapped her, but still, she didn't look away. Maybe for the first time in her life, she couldn't. I tried, Diane, I said, using her name now like a scalpel, cutting through years of obligation. I tried to be the daughter you wanted, even if it meant breaking myself into pieces just to fit the shape you needed. But no matter what I did, I was always too plain, too serious, too much work. Her eyes shone then, and for a split second, I saw something in them that looked a little like grief. But it passed just as quickly, replaced by that familiar defensiveness, that tight-lipped pride she wore like armor. I gave you everything I had, she said, voice shaking. I kept this house together. I raised you girls alone. No, you didn't, I said. You kept the house clean, sure. You kept the lights on. But raising someone means seeing them. And you only ever looked at me when you wanted something from me, silence, support, obedience. She looked away then, turning back to the yard, like it might rescue her from what she wasn't ready to face. I let the silence hang for a moment, then finished what I came to say. I'm done chasing you, I said. I'm done measuring myself by your disappointment. You said Chloe will always be the beautiful one. Maybe she will. But I'm not invisible anymore. Not to myself. I stood then, slowly, letting the creak of the old porch boards punctuate the moment. She didn't stop me. Didn't call out. She just sat there, still as stone, holding a half-full glass of wine and a lifetime of consequences she never expected to cash in. And here's the thing people don't understand about family. Just because you share blood doesn't mean you owe them your soul. Some wounds aren't dramatic or loud or bloody. Some of them are quiet, subtle, a series of tiny cuts that never quite heal because they're always being reopened by a glance, a comment, a fucking toast. So I'll ask you again, if you finally told someone the truth they spent their life denying, and it left them speechless, not because you were cruel, but because you were right, would you feel guilty? Or would you feel free? Because that night, as I walked back into the house, left Diane on the porch, and climbed into bed, I didn't feel like the villain. I felt like someone who'd finally come up for air after drowning for decades. And maybe, just maybe, she was the one who couldn't swim. The strange thing about memory is that it doesn't always arrive in order. It comes back in flashes, jagged and inconvenient, landing like broken glass in the places you've tried to keep clean. Chloe sat in Diane's room the next morning, curled into the same chair we used to fight over as kids, her eyes dark with something I couldn't name just yet, something unsettled. The curtains were half drawn, and the sunlight spilled across the bed in a way that made the silence seem theatrical, like the final scene of a play no one wanted to admit had ended. She hadn't spoken to me since the night before, not a single word after our argument in the kitchen, not after she stormed upstairs to try and coax Diane into something resembling movement. But now, as I leaned against the doorway watching her sit there motionless, it was obvious that something in her had shifted, not because of me necessarily, but because something long dormant inside her had started to stir. And that scared her more than anything I could have said. She used to make me change my clothes before school, Chloe said suddenly, her voice brittle, as if the words had been sitting inside her throat all night. Said I needed to look like someone she was proud of. Said the other girls would be jealous, and I needed to be prepared for that. I stepped into the room slowly, cautious not to shatter whatever spell had allowed her to start saying these things out loud. Diane didn't move on the bed, didn't blink, didn't offer any reaction to her daughter's confession. She just lay there, still and unreachable, as though she'd been unplugged from the world and left to float in the dark. She told me once, Chloe continued, staring at the wall instead of at me, that if I ever gained more than 10 pounds, she'd stop buying me clothes. Because she didn't raise a lazy girl. Her voice cracked on that phrase, and for a second, she looked younger than I'd seen her in years, smaller, less perfect, fragile in a way she never allowed herself to be. I remember that, I said quietly. It was the summer after 9th grade. You didn't eat at the 4th of July party. Said you had a stomach bug. She gave me a laxative and told me to shut up about it, Chloe whispered, finally looking at me now, and her eyes weren't angry anymore. They were wide with realization, like she was staring at a stranger in the mirror. I thought she was protecting me. I thought she wanted me to be special. She wanted to control you, I said, gently but firmly. Just like she wanted to control me. She just used different methods. Chloe didn't respond right away. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out something I hadn't seen in years, a spiral-bound notebook, the cover faded and soft at the edges like it had been handled 1,000 times. She handed it to me without saying anything, and I recognized it instantly. It was one of mine. A journal I kept in high school, one of the few places where I actually allowed myself to be angry, to write down the things I couldn't say out loud in a house where the only emotion allowed was gratitude. I flipped through it slowly, recognizing my old handwriting, the pressed flower I'd once taped to the inside cover, pages and pages of frustration written in the margins of my own self-doubt. Chloe watched me, her breathing shallow, like she was afraid of what she'd already read. You wrote about me, she said. About how you used to envy me, but also hate me. I didn't know you felt that way. I didn't either, I admitted. Not then. I thought I hated you, but really, I hated that you didn't see it. That you didn't see what she was doing to both of us. I thought you were lucky, she said, and her voice broke again. You got to be smart. You got to escape. I was stuck being the doll. There was a long silence between us after that, one of those rare moments where neither of us felt the need to fill it, because the truth had taken up all the space it needed. It was there, thick and undeniable, sitting between us like a third sibling we'd both ignored for too long. I pulled a folded note from the back of the journal then, one I had completely forgotten about, and handed it to her without a word. Her name was written on the front in block letters. Chloe. It had no date, but I remembered writing it, probably during one of those nights where I felt like screaming into a pillow wasn't enough. She opened it slowly, hands trembling, and read in silence. I remembered the words even before she did. You were the beautiful one, it said. But I was the disposable one. And now I see that maybe you were never as lucky as I thought. Tears came fast then, not the performative kind Chloe had learned to use over the years, but the real kind, messy and involuntary, the kind that comes when the lie you've lived with your entire life finally bursts open and the truth bleeds out everywhere. She dropped the note into her lap and looked at Diane, who still hadn't moved, still hadn't spoken, and for the first time, she didn't seem like our mother. She seemed like someone else entirely, a woman made of paper and old perfume and thinly veiled regrets. She did this to us, Chloe said, more to herself than to me. All of it. She built this house out of mirrors and lies, and now it's finally cracking. I nodded because there was nothing else to do. Sometimes the only justice you get is survival. Sometimes the only vindication is watching someone finally see what you've been carrying alone for years. And here's the part that stings: recognition doesn't come with repair. Chloe seeing it now doesn't undo what she let happen, what she was part of, even unknowingly. But it does mean that maybe we can stop pretending it was ever okay. So I ask you, if the person who was held up as the golden child finally saw the rot under the gold leaf, would you forgive them? Or would you let them sit with it the way you had to for years on end? Because the truth is, Sometimes the apology you've waited for comes in the form of a breakdown, and sometimes that's the only version of it you'll ever get. The knock at the front door was slow and deliberate, the kind of knock that doesn't expect to be welcomed but shows up anyway, because some ghosts don't wait for an invitation. They return when they're ready, regardless of whether anyone left the porch light on. I already knew who it was before I opened the door, not because he'd warned us, but because there are only a few people in this world who still know how to make the floor under my feet feel like it's shifting, even before they speak. And my father, James, was absolutely one of them. He stood there holding a canvas duffel bag, wearing that same tired expression he'd worn the last time he left this house, years ago, when he decided the tension in Diane's voice was too much to live with and the silence from her was worse than shouting. His gray hair was a little thinner, his frame a little slighter, but there was still something defiant in the way he stood, like he had walked back into a fire on purpose, knowing full well he might get burned again. "I came as soon as Chloe called," he said, not even pretending to soften the moment with small talk or forced emotion. "She said your mother's not speaking." I stepped aside to let him in, but I didn't say anything right away. There's something cruel about reunions like that, something hollow in the way people act like time didn't sharpen the edges of everything left unsaid. He looked around the living room like he was seeing an old crime scene, his eyes tracing the walls, the photos, the chair Diane always used, now empty and gathering dust like it belonged to someone long gone. "She's upstairs," I finally said. "Same place you left her." He winced a little at that, but he didn't argue. Maybe he knew there wasn't anything to say in his defense that wouldn't sound like an excuse, and to his credit, he didn't try. "How bad is it?" he asked as he set the bag down by the stairs. "She's not eating, not talking, barely blinking," I said. "But her eyes follow us. She's there. She just isn't coming out." He ran a hand through his hair, then sat on the edge of the couch like he was already carrying the weight of something he didn't know how to name. "Diane never broke," he said quietly, almost like he was remembering it for the first time. "She bent people, manipulated them, shaped the world around herself like clay, but she never broke. Even when we fought, even when I told her I couldn't take it anymore, she just smiled and said I'd be back." "And now?" I asked, not out of curiosity, but out of some deep, long-starved place in me that wanted him to see her the way I had for years. "Now she looks like someone finally showed her who she really is," he said. For a moment, I hated how easy it came to him, this sudden insight, this quick summary of everything we'd lived through while he'd been off playing the role of the distant parent. But then again, sometimes it takes a long absence to see the full shape of someone's damage. From a distance, maybe Diane did seem like she had it all together, elegant, firm, composed. But up close, she was full of cracks, sharp edges hidden under pearls and perfume. Chloe came down the stairs not long after, her eyes wide when she saw him, her lips parting like she wasn't sure whether to hug him or hit him. She chose neither. She just sat beside him, silent, as if the shock of having both of our parents under one roof again had temporarily disabled her. "You look like hell," he said to her with a sad kind of smile. "We all do," she said, not looking at him. There was something eerie about seeing them next to each other again, two people who had once loved each other enough to build a life, to have children, to share the same bed, now reduced to two strangers quietly counting the pieces of what had been shattered in their absence. He cleared his throat and looked between us like he wanted to ask something, but wasn't sure which daughter would give him an honest answer. "What happened?" he asked finally. "What did you say to her?" I looked at Chloe first, and she nodded just once, because she knew the weight of that question didn't belong to me alone anymore. "I told her the truth," I said. "About the favoritism. About the years of manipulation. About how her love always came with a price tag." James leaned forward, elbows on his knees, head in his hands. "And she listened?" "For the first time," I said. "And for the last, maybe?" He sat like that for a long time, the silence stretching so thick it could have been cut with a knife. When he finally looked up again, His eyes were glassy but dry, like he didn't think he had the right to cry anymore. I left because I was weak, he said. I thought if I stayed, I'd become like her. I didn't realize leaving made me something else entirely. A ghost, I said. You became a ghost. And he didn't argue with that either. Later that night, I found him in the kitchen alone, holding a photograph from one of those staged holiday cards we used to send out, back when appearances mattered more than honesty. He held it like it was evidence in a trial that never got its day in court. You girls deserved better, he said quietly. And I don't know if I'll ever deserve to be forgiven for letting it go on. I didn't answer him because forgiveness is complicated, and some answers don't come in a single night or even a lifetime. But I'll ask you this. If the person who abandoned you finally came back not to fix things, but to bear witness to your pain, is that enough? Is presence, however late, ever a form of redemption? Because sometimes the only apology left is showing up when everything's already fallen apart and staying through the silence that follows. It was sometime past midnight when I found myself in the attic, surrounded by dust and forgotten boxes, chasing a memory I couldn't quite place, but knew was hiding somewhere beneath yellowed photo albums and the sharp, dry smell of insulation. The light bulb flickered above me like it was deciding whether I deserved illumination or not, and I stood there for a moment, breathing in the stale air, knowing damn well that this wasn't just about finding an old videotape or a letter. This was about proving, maybe even to myself, that I hadn't imagined the years of quiet sabotage and whispered cruelty that had shaped every corner of this house like mold no one wanted to clean. I found it buried in a box labeled Holiday 2007, shoved between a fake wreath and a plastic pumpkin with one eye missing. A small stack of mini DV tapes, most unlabeled, but one marked in Diane's neat cursive, Chloe, birthday 12. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the dusty old camcorder and prayed it still worked, jammed in a battery, and brought it downstairs with the same energy you carry when you're holding a loaded gun that might not fire. Chloe was half asleep on the living room couch, curled up under a blanket she used to carry around like a shield when we were kids, and James was sitting silently beside her, staring at nothing like it might finally say something back. I walked in, dropped the camcorder on the table, and said, I found something. And you both need to see it. It took a few minutes to find the right adapter, a few more to find the old TV in the garage, and by the time we had everything plugged in, the air in the room felt thick enough to drown in. The video started with laughter, high-pitched, childish, the sound of Chloe squealing with joy as she ripped into a pile of birthday presents in the backyard, surrounded by a circle of older women clapping politely. The kind of people who always smiled too hard and drank wine out of red Solo cups like they were at a country club. Then Diane's voice came through the speakers, bright and sharp, full of performative cheer. Oh, Chloe, you're just radiant today, she said, zooming in on her daughter's face as she held up a glittery pink sweater. You're gonna break hearts someday, sweetheart, just like your mama. Off camera, you could hear someone say, what about Emily? And then a pause, just long enough to matter, before Diane's voice returned, colder now. Emily's sweet, but let's be honest, she's more of a brains-over-beauty type. She'll make some nice man very organized someday. The room went silent. On screen, 12-year-old me stood awkwardly near the cake table, half smiling like I was trying not to cry, pretending not to hear the laughter that followed. Even James flinched, his jaw tightening, hands gripping his knees. Chloe sat upright, eyes wide, watching herself open gifts while I stood 10 feet away like a background extra in my own family's home video. She turned to me slowly, and for once, there was no defense in her face, no ready line, no instinct to protect the version of the past she'd clung to for so long. I don't remember that, she said, voice low. I don't. I didn't know she said that. You didn't have to, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. You felt it. You lived it. You benefited from it. James stood up then, walked out of the room without a word, probably heading toward the porch or the whiskey bottle he'd been avoiding all evening. Chloe stayed rooted to the couch, staring at the now frozen image on the screen, me in the background, holding a paper plate with no cake on it, shoulders curled in like I'd already learned my presence was an inconvenience. She made me think I had to be perfect, Chloe said after a long pause, her voice thick with realization. She made me think if I wasn't, I'd lose her. But I never saw what it did to you. I didn't respond, because that was the thing about realizations. They're only as powerful as what you do after them. Acknowledging the truth was one thing. Living with it was another. Then she asked the question I hadn't expected. Do you think she knew what she was doing? Or do you think she just thought that was love? And I stood there, the camcorder still humming faintly like it had more secrets to tell, wondering how to answer that without sounding cruel. I think she loved us both the way someone loves a reflection, I said. She loved what made her look good. And anything else she ignored. Chloe blinked hard, then got up and walked past me, not saying another word. I don't know if she was going to Diane's room or just away from the truth, but I let her go. Some things have to be processed in private, away from the people who were part of the damage. I sat alone with the image still frozen on the screen, staring at a younger version of myself who hadn't yet learned how to stop asking for scraps of love from someone who didn't know how to give it freely. And I wondered how different my life might have been if someone had stopped the camera, pulled me aside, and told me none of this was normal. So I'll ask you this, when the proof is finally undeniable, when it plays out in front of you with all its casual cruelty and soft, smiling violence, what do you do with it? Do you forgive the person who let it happen, even if they were a child themselves? Or do you let them carry the weight now, the same weight you've dragged around in silence for years? Because the truth may set you free, sure, but not before it shatters the cage you spent your whole life decorating. The house was so quiet the next morning that it felt like we were living inside someone else's dream, the kind where nothing quite belongs where it should, where sounds are muted and the light feels a little too soft, a little too unreal. Like the world was holding its breath to see if we'd all finally exhale. I stood outside Diane's bedroom door for a long time, my fingers curled loosely into a fist, but never knocking, because I wasn't sure anymore what I expected from her, an apology, a breakdown, a scream, or maybe just a single word to prove that everything we had unearthed hadn't turned her entirely to stone. Behind me, the hallway creaked as Chloe approached, barefoot and quiet, her face pale but alert, like she hadn't slept, but had instead stayed up replaying every moment from that video. Every line she'd once believed was just motherly pride instead of a weapon pointed in both directions. She didn't say anything as she reached me, only leaned against the wall with her arms folded, her lips pressed into a thin line that told me she was thinking the same thing I was. What happens now, after the story's already been told? I thought I hated you, she said finally, her voice so soft I almost missed it, like she was confessing to herself more than to me. Not because of anything you did, but because I saw you as the one thing she didn't love. And if she didn't love you, then I had to make sure she loved me more. I needed to stay on her good side, no matter what. I know, I said, not to let her off the hook, but because part of me had always known, even when I couldn't say it out loud. She turned us into opposites on purpose. You were the sparkle, I was the shadow. It was never supposed to be about us loving each other. It was about earning her. Chloe slid down the wall until she was sitting on the floor, arms wrapped around her knees like the teenager she hadn't been in years. But I never really earned her, she whispered. Not really. I performed for her, I molded myself into whatever she needed, and the moment I stopped fitting that image, she turned cold, just like she did to you all those years ago. And there it was, understanding, clear and painful, like a fresh scar you can finally see in the mirror after ignoring it for so long. I sat down beside her, letting the silence between us settle into something different this time, not the old kind filled with blame and resentment, but something quieter, heavier, more human. We weren't enemies anymore. We were survivors of the same war, only just now realizing we'd both been drafted without consent. We stayed like that for a while, side by side in the hallway of a house that had never truly been a home, until the door creaked behind us, slow and deliberate, and Diane appeared in the frame, thin, hollow-eyed, and wrapped in the same cardigan she'd worn 2 nights ago, the one that smelled faintly of lavender and guilt. Her face was blank at first, expressionless, as if emotion had been scrubbed clean from her features, but when she saw us sitting there, her lip trembled just once before she spoke. "I didn't know how else to be," she said, barely above a whisper, her voice dry and brittle like pages left too long in the sun. We didn't respond. Not because we didn't have anything to say, but because what could possibly be said in response to a confession that came years too late and in a tone that sounded more like excuse than remorse? Diane stepped into the hallway, clutching the doorframe like it was the only thing keeping her upright. She looked first at Chloe, then at me, and for the first time in my life, I think I saw her, truly saw her, not as the woman who had made me feel like a burden, not as the sculptor of my sister's pedestal, but as someone deeply afraid. Afraid of irrelevance, of loss, of love she couldn't control. "I wanted you both to be strong," she said. "I thought if I pushed you, you'd never break." "You didn't make us strong," I said, not harshly, but with the clarity of someone who's been waiting her whole life to speak. "You made us hard. There's a difference." Diane lowered her eyes, but not before I saw the tears beginning to well in them, silent and stubborn, like they hadn't been invited but showed up anyway. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't even ask us to understand. She just stood there, swaying slightly in her shame, and for a moment I almost felt sorry for her almost. Later that day, as the sun began to lower behind the trees and the house took on that golden glow that made everything look softer than it really was, Chloe and I sat on the back porch, watching as Diane moved slowly through the living room, folding laundry she hadn't touched in days. It felt surreal, watching her re-enter the world like a ghost learning to walk again. "You think she's changed?" Chloe asked, sipping her coffee without looking at me. "I think she cracked," I said. "Whether anything grows out of that is up to her." We sat in silence again, the good kind this time, the kind that feels earned. Chloe handed me the note I'd written her years ago, now folded neatly and kept in her wallet. She didn't say anything, but I knew what it meant. We weren't fixed. We weren't healed. But maybe we were no longer pretending the wound wasn't there. And here's where I'll leave you, not with a neat ending, not with a redemption arc tied up in bows, but with something real. Diane didn't apologize the way I once dreamed she might. Chloe didn't fall into my arms and promise to make everything right. But for the first time, we were 3 women standing in the aftermath of truth, and no one was running anymore. So I'll ask you one last time, if someone spends your whole life defining you by what you lack, and then finally they see you for who you are, does it matter if it's too late? Can seeing the truth be enough, even if it doesn't come with an apology? Or do we only measure worth in the timing of regret? Because when Diane looked at me that evening and asked, in the smallest voice I've ever heard her use, "Are you happy now?" I didn't answer. Not because I didn't know, but because happiness isn't the prize for surviving someone like her. It's the quiet, hard-earned space you finally carve out for yourself when you stop asking anyone else to hand it to you.